Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF in Conversation, the Jewish Film Podcast.
We are back for another monthly edition of What to Watch, this time for the month of July in 2021.
Yeah, and again, I think the last time we did this for June or maybe even May, theaters were starting to open back up. I think we're seeing more and more of that. So lots of things, lots of interesting things are coming to theaters, but this month I think it's mostly Blu-ray and streaming still.
It is. It's that time of year when all of the Marvel films like to come out, and thus far, unfortunately, Marvel has not released a Jewish superhero movie, so we're stuck with the stuff that you can watch at home in July. I know August has some theatrical releases coming down the pike, but this time it is some interesting film and television, I would say. Some of this stuff is AJFF alum. Some of this stuff is completely new. The first thing I think is probably worth talking about is the one that's getting all the buzz, which is a new reality show that's coming to Netflix. And I should just stress right up front, I am not a reality TV guy. So I am not so much looking forward to this show as I am just kind of slightly horrified. It is called My Unorthodox Life. And basically, the premise of the show is there's a woman named Julia Hart. For some reason, I think her last name is spelled with two A's. She grew up or was married into, or in some form or fashion, used to be part of the ultra-Orthodox community. And she has left that community, and she is now the CEO of Elite World Group, which is if you follow the world of fashion and modeling, is like the biggest modeling agency or conglomerate of modeling agencies in the world. And she has 4 kids. And the reality show is basically about her and her 4 adult kids who are no longer living an ultra-Orthodox lifestyle, but they kind of came from an ultra-Orthodox. So there's this weird juxtaposition between their current lifestyle, which is basically the lifestyles of the rich and famous, and the sort of cloistered ultra-Orthodox. I feel like I'm doing this show horrible because it is not my genre. Sarah, do you watch these kinds of shows? Please tell me no.
I don't. The best I could the best I could offer to this conversation and to talking about the genre and in this new series is that in college I took a class called Media and Society, and there were all these different sections, different focuses, and mine happened to be reality TV. And even at the time I was like, oh my gosh, like I don't watch any of these shows. I think we had to pick one show for a final project, and I picked The Real World. Flash forward now, my one guilty pleasure reality show is Catfish on MTV, and hey, Neve Schulman's Jewish, so I don't feel that bad bringing that up here. But yeah, other than that, even competition shows, which are kind of in a league of their own, this is a world that I am also very new to. Like even now in reality TV, again, has been going on since The Real World started in the early 90s. But I think it is kind of interesting that this show shows you someone's life that maybe we don't really get that often in this genre, but that juxtaposition you were talking about, I think is really fascinating because it is a genre where we don't really get stories like this. We barely even get stories like this still in narrative media and documentaries. And so I don't know, it's an interesting choice. And I have also been hearing a lot of buzz about it. So
I'm just horrified by the prospect of like a Jewish Keeping Up with the Kardashians, because the Keeping Up with the Kardashians kind of show to me is the worst possible kind of reality television you can get. I'm with you. I watch competition shows. I like Project Runway. I like Lego Masters. I like those kinds of shows. They are quote unquote reality television, but there is a conceit to them and a structure to them. It's a little like sports, which I happily consume. But this kind of show is just people pretending that this is their actual day-to-day lives, and that there's not a bunch of cameras and a bunch of producers helping to shape the quote-unquote unscripted nature of these existences, when in fact it is the most scripted thing you've ever seen in your life. And I don't know that that's what this is, because I have not watched it yet. There's just an enormous amount of buzz about it. And look, I'm hopeful that this could be an interesting sort of platform to talk about what the reality of Orthodox Jewish customs and practices really are, and how people can kind of move into and out of that world. And if it is that, then I will retract everything I've said and apologize profusely to Julia Hart, her family, and the producers of this show. But knowing that it is about someone who is the head of a bunch of modeling agencies, and at least the trailer for this makes it look a lot like Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I have very limited hope.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a marketing thing, though. I also haven't checked this out yet. But, you know, for better or worse, something that we always come back to, I think, at AJFF with films, too, is like, okay, well, this is starting conversations. I actually heard about this show first from Alma. Listeners of this podcast will know we've had a couple of awesome writers from Alma on the podcast before, and I am always so impressed by the thoughtful content that they're putting out there. So I have seen a couple of posts from them about this show, just different sort of think pieces and opinions and analyses. So I've bookmarked those, and, you know, maybe reading those and watching the show will give us a fuller picture. Listeners listening to us and maybe go check out those articles, you know, we'll kind of get like a fuller picture of what this show is and what it's trying to do. I'm not sure, but it is interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, look, there's 4 adult kids that really apparently are the focus of the show. The mother, Julia, is kind of like the anchor, but she's not the primary focus. And you know, you can see a lot of interesting potential there. There's one, I think her youngest kid still wears the kippah, you know, clearly is not as far along in terms of his departure from the Orthodox world than maybe some of the other kids are. There's certainly opportunity here, and like I said, I'm hopeful. I do think that there has been this kind of trend of Jewish content, particularly on streaming, Netflix and other services, that dives into the ultra Orthodox and the Orthodox communities, and that's a part of the Jewish world that has gotten, frankly, less attention in film and television than it deserves, because it's this niche within a niche, but it's rich with dramatic potential, if nothing else. And so I do hope that the show really does explore that in a way that is not exploitative, that does not oversimplify things. We'll see. I mean, I never heard of this person. She's apparently very rich and somewhat famous. I've never heard of her, but I'm also not into the world of fashion modeling, so who knows? But it is called My Unorthodox Life. We don't exactly recommend it, but we're kind of deeply, morbidly curious about it. So maybe that's enough. And maybe if you watch it, email us, let us know if we're completely off the mark. We probably will watch it at some point and talk about it in depth, God help me, in a future episode of the podcast. But that's just one thing that's coming out in the month of July. We also have an AJFF alum is showing up on Netflix. This is The Operative, which played at the 2020 festival. This was, for those who remember, that was the last time we were all in person back in February of 2020. And I was super excited about it because it headlined Diane Kruger, who I am a huge fan of. Diane Kruger is one of my favorite actresses. And The Operative came along and featured her and also Martin Freeman. Do you remember watching this, Sarah?
I do. I remember thinking to myself, oh gosh, like this is not going back to genres that don't come easy to us or that we don't automatically gravitate toward, the sort of spy, espionage, global, you know, duplicitousness and agents and all of those kinds of buzzwords. Those are not usually the things that grab me as far as if I'm choosing to go watch a film, but of course it was part of AJFF. I also love Diane Kruger. I love Martin Freeman. I watched it and I just remember being really pleasantly surprised. It was gripping. It wasn't so confusing. I think sometimes spy movies, I think that's my biggest hang up is I'll be like, wait, who's tricking who and what's happening here and what's the real mission? I don't know if that's something to judge me for, but this film really, it was it was accessible and it was entertaining and it was really, the performances were fantastic. as we said, yeah, Diane Kruger is just always fabulous. Anyone that hasn't seen the German film she was in a couple years ago, in The Fade, she's just so magnetic to watch. And so I think that was a big part of it for me. But really, this film is just very engrossing and accomplished. So I'm glad to see that it's coming to Netflix, and hopefully more people will get to watch it that way.
I think it speaks very well of you that you are so honest and not at all cut out for the layers of deception and intrigue that espionage comes along with. But I love that genre. I mean, give me a Bond film, give me a Bourne film, give me a spy film any day of the week. So for me, Diane Kruger and a spy film, I was sold right from the go. And you're right, the film absolutely paid off. And it's timely. I mean, she plays a Mossad agent who's gone rogue. She's kind of, Martin Freeman plays her old handler. There's an affair with an Iranian businessman. The Iranian nuclear program is part of the story. It's just really, really well executed, in a way that, there are two types of spy movies. There's the sort of action-packed spy movie, which is the Bond and the Bourne films. This is not as much that. There certainly is some action, but it's just more of a kind of a slow-burning, the Constant Gardener, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, that kind of spy story. And it's just really, really good. And it's coming to Netflix, which means you can watch it probably for essentially free, because who doesn't subscribe to Netflix at this point? I really cannot recommend The Operative highly enough. I just can't. It's just so good. There's another film, though, also coming to Netflix, also coming to Amazon Prime. And this film itself is not what I would call overtly Jewish. But Sarah, tell me, are you a fan of the late, great Charles Grodin?
I'm once again ashamed and embarrassed to admit that I am not super familiar with him or his work. So this is another month of, Sarah kind of getting introduced to things through our What to Watch, which, I'm always happy to admit my shortcomings and blind spots in the world of film and pop culture. I have heard of this film, though, that we're about to talk about. So I'm happy to know that there are a couple places to stream it, because I will add it to my list of classics that I probably should have seen by now, which is a real list that I have started on Letterboxd for myself, and it is embarrassingly long. So this will go on there.
Everybody has that list. I promise you. There are so many films to watch in the world, and there are some incredible classics, and nobody's watched them all, unless you're maybe Quentin Tarantino or Edgar Wright. But Charles Grodin was in a film, and it was called Midnight Run, and that is the film we are talking about. And for those who did not know, Charles Grodin passed away in May, and it was a great loss. He was a Jewish-American actor. He was incredibly versatile. He was kind of known for his comedy work, but it wasn't slapsticky comedy per se. It was this kind of, it was like low-key neurotic Jewish persona comedy, but not necessarily in straight up humor, if that makes sense. The humor was kind of sly, subversive, and he was phenomenal. He made a big name for himself in the early 70s with The Heartbreak Kid, which is another film where he played a Jewish guy who ditches his bride. So you should hate him, but you don't. He's somehow sympathetic in that film, and he's just so good. And he sort of made a career for himself. He was never a top-line headliner, big star, but he played opposite some incredible stars and actors, and never ever felt like he couldn't hold his own. And in The Midnight Run, which was released in 1988, he co-starred with Robert De Niro, and he played a mob accountant, and Robert De Niro played a bounty hunter. And he literally spends the bulk of the film handcuffed to Robert De Niro, side by side with one of the greatest actors of the 20th century. And he absolutely holds his own with De Niro in this film. And he's not an overtly Jewish character in the film, but his persona as an actor, it was a little bit like, Jeff Goldblum's persona. He just sort of was synonymous with this Jewish American character, and he plays a mob accountant. So it's not hard to read into that character a Jewish identity. And it's a classic film. It's absolutely just an amazingly well-shot film, well-acted film. It's really the performances that carry that film. And I can't recommend it enough, but I really put it on the list because of Charles Grodin, because I was waiting for an opportunity to honor him, his life, his career. He has been in so many good things. But again, very under the radar. If you didn't grow up in that era watching him work, you could easily not have a clue who he was. And I do not begrudge anybody who doesn't have a clue who he was, but anybody who doesn't, I immediately say you've got to go watch The Heartbreak Kid and you've got to go watch Midnight Run. And thankfully for all of the people that I say that to, you can now watch Midnight Run on Netflix or Amazon Prime. Take your pick. If you don't have a subscription to one of those services, who are you? Do you even live in this country? Everybody has one of those too, and you should go run to watch Midnight Run like right now.
Or right after you're done listening to this.
No, right now.
Like just
completely pause this podcast, go watch Midnight Run, come back. We're not going anywhere. The beauty of podcasting is you can always pick us back up. It's that good. It really is. And Sarah, I do not begrudge you having never seen it or not knowing a lot of Charles Grodin's work, but you would love him because he was like, you know, he would have been perfect in Schitt's Creek.
Interesting. I mean, is the, like, again, completely ignorant student role here, like Midnight Run, what genre would you say it is? Because it almost sounds to me like it's kind of straddling a few different things. Like unlike spy movies, I love Martin Scorsese. I'll go watch, you know, if it's really good, you know, different kind of mob movies. Robert De Niro is one of my favorite actors for sure, especially his work in the 70s, 80s, and, you know, up through Goodfellas in particular. Mm-hmm. So where does Midnight Run fit? Just so I kind of know.
It is more comedy, I think, than anything else. Okay. But again, it's a comedy. It's not slapsticky comedy. It's not schlocky comedy. It is kind of smirky, sly, clever comedy. Because it's got little bits of, it's got a little bit of action. It's got a little bit of that, of a mob story. It's got a little bit of thriller in it. It's got a little bit of everything kind of dashed in there, but it is more serio comedy kind of it's not dramedy per se, but it's like borderline dramedy. It's definitely got some dramatic elements, but it's more comedy than it's anything else, I think. But it's that, like, they don't make this stuff anymore. Like, this is like late 80s, very adult comedy. And, you know, it's a mob accountant. He goes on the run and he gets, you know, it's got all the tropes that you would expect from a late 80s mob drama, but it kind of swerves it to funny. And you pair Robert De Niro, who we all kind of know that Robert De Niro straight character that kind of he parodied himself in Meet the Fockers, Meet the Parents, Meet the Fockers, that whole franchise. He plays a character a little bit like that. He's kind of a serious, no-nonsense bounty hunter, and then he's sort of stuck with Charles Grodin's mob accountant who just wants to get away. And there's a little bit of that kind of buddy. It's sort of a buddy picture in that way. It's a buddy comedy, but it's a little bit more dramatic than your average buddy comedy from the late 80s, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely makes me even more intrigued to check it out. I love things that kind of mix and mingle genres, especially, you know, kind of treating perhaps a topic or set of characters with humor and comedy over, you know, something that's maybe more predictable for, as you said, kind of a mob story. You know, I love movies like that, especially from the 80s. So I am definitely interested because, as you said, they don't really make movies like that anymore. But just to kind of segue, because I think that does bring us really nicely to our first pick as far as what's on Blu-ray this month. This is another sort of unconventional comedy, certainly much more contemporary. And it's another AJFF alum that we have talked about on this podcast, which is Shiva Baby from Emma Seligman. And this movie just continues to have momentum and buzz. And I think it's so deserving of that. And I think the conversation around it just continues to fascinate me. And, you know, I'm just so happy for this director. And I'm just excited to see that this film has legs and that we showed it this past February.
It is a great film. we have talked about it at this point, I think, ad nauseum. I was actually very amused that our friend of the pod, Matt Goldberg, on his podcast over at Collider.com, talked about watching this film this past week, now that it's on Blu-ray, and he described it as almost a horror film. He's like, it is so deeply uncomfortable that it makes you so deeply uncomfortable in much the same way that horror films make you uncomfortable. It is not a horror film, but it was the first time anybody had described it that way. And I couldn't help but kind of chuckle, because this is a film that does, as you said, keep getting talked about. It just sort of has this, you can't watch it and not come away wanting to talk about it.
Yeah. And
which is a huge accomplishment.
I completely agree. I think, and I love that Matt sort of positioned it as a bit of a horror movie, because it's only recently that I've been sort of starting to see that opinion going around. And it's funny because when I first watched it, that creepy kind of klezmer soundtrack, that the score, it's just so uncomfortable, and it heightens the emotion in every scene. There's this one scene that I'm sure I've probably talked about before on this podcast with kind of like a fisheye, you know, the choices that she makes. This film is kind of one of those uncomfortable comedies that, and shout out to Alma again too, because there was a post there was an article there about how this film and The Vigil, which we've talked about and also showed this past festival, can kind of be thought of together, paired together as these two new approaches to Jewish horror. And I love dark comedy. I love horror. I just love that people are starting to sort of think about this film in multiple genres and in multiple ways, because it is very cringeworthy and such an accomplishment to make us all that uncomfortable in a comedy. So yeah.
I mean, it is rare that you recommend something that you're also calling cringe, but it's cringe in the best way. It is so, it is designed to make you uncomfortable. The character is so deeply uncomfortable pretty much the entire film. It is just brilliantly executed. And we should not stop mentioning that Emma Seligman is essentially a first-time director. She did this as a short film. She turned it into a feature film. This was her first feature. And she's made this, and this blew up on the festival circuit, played at Toronto. And I can't wait to see what she does with the rest of her career. Hopefully it won't be a Marvel movie, because that's where all the good indie directors seem to go after they break out. She's just amazing. I mean, it's just flawless execution. Whether you like it or whether you can't stand that level of cringe, the execution is unquestionable with Shiva Baby. So, that's hitting a Blu-ray this month, which I cannot recommend enough. There's a couple of other films that are older films hitting Blu-ray this month, one of which is a re-release, which is weird. We'll talk about that in a second. But before we talk about that, I wanted to mention tentatively The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And the reason I say tentatively is because, to me, this is a film that has a phenomenal cast and is fairly well shot. But it was very controversial when it was released. I don't know if you know the backstory on this, Sarah, but this is essentially a Holocaust tragedy. There's two 8-year-old boys, one of whom is an inmate in a Jewish concentration camp, and one of whom is the son of the camp commander, so the son of a Nazi. And there's a novel, same name, that the film was adapted from, and it's got factual inaccuracies, to be sure, but also it was criticized for sort of being sympathetic to the Nazi family in the story. I don't know if you've ever seen this film. It starred Asa Butterfield and Vera Farmiga and David Thewlis, who phenomenal actors, all of them. But I just think that for all of the controversy around this film, it is an interesting discussion point in the history of Holocaust films, because the question of how do you portray Nazis, how do you portray an 8-year-old child of Nazis, and is there a point at which you can portray them too sympathetically? To me, it's just a fascinating question. So the film is good. I mean, it's not great, but it's good. But that's not what is interesting to me about this particular pick. What's interesting to me is the discussion around the film. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that subject, on that question, but to me, it's just utterly fascinating.
I agree. I have not seen this film, but just everything that you were mentioning reminds me of when I was, and I'm not name dropping this little fun party fact again for the sake of it, but when I was the TA for Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, it was for a Holocaust, like a films about the Holocaust class. And I feel like this is a question that just continues to come up. I mean, how do you portray these events in a way that's perhaps cathartic, not exploitative? The things that I've heard about this film were basically that it could be a little manipulative, and I suppose that it's those inaccuracies that you were talking about that add to that, and also just having potentially too sympathetic a portrayal of the Nazi characters. I think those are issues that we see in Holocaust cinema, sprinkled throughout Holocaust cinema. It's difficult territory. It's tricky. It's tricky to do as a filmmaker. I think it's tricky to talk about. I do caution people when it comes to films like this, if you're going to watch it, do some reading. I almost wish that the world was like film school, where there are certain films that just benefit from someone talking to you afterwards, like our Q&As, or like having like a quick article that you could read beforehand that prepares you for some of these things to look out for. I don't know. This film was not something that was in that syllabus, but these kinds of issues that come up around this film are, as you say, very fascinating. I just hope, that people do watch this movie with an eye toward those issues, because if you don't, I think you're missing something that this film could potentially be teaching us, actually.
Yeah, you are deeply optimistic, I think, about most people's preparation for watching a movie.
Oh, I'm not saying,
I agree with you.
I'm saying that in a perfect world, we would all have a little primer or a little discussion after, because there are films that I had the benefit of seeing in film school that I liked a lot better than people who maybe didn't have that experience. And I'm like, oh, well, it's because I was looking out for, this thing that I knew about the national cinema at the time, or about the filmmaker's life, or whatever it is. I'm definitely not optimistic, but it's just something that in a perfect world, I wish people would be able to have that easily, or want to go seek that out before or after seeing films like this. I know that it'll never happen.
No, I agree. I mean, that's the beauty. We're talking about a movie that's coming out on Blu-ray. The beauty of Blu-ray, to me, and DVDs, is that so many of them come with extra material. And a lot of those films, especially nowadays, that's just, it's marketing fluff. The supplemental materials are not that interesting. But to me, the power of Blu-rays is you get, director's commentaries and, all sorts of extra stuff that let you dive a little bit into the films. This is a film that absolutely begs for that kind of context, for all the reasons we've talked about. And so I hope, I say that not knowing off the top of my head what extras are on the Blu-ray, but my hope is there are some good extras on the Blu-ray for this film, because it does need it. There is one last film that we should talk about before we go. It is a weird film to be talking about because it's been out on Blu-ray for quite some time, but it is getting a re-release for some reason. I do not know why. As far as I know, the Blu-ray is not wildly different from previous releases, but it is a beautiful film. It is called Milk. And if you have seen it, you know exactly why. It is a absolutely phenomenal performance by Sean Penn playing the Jewish gay rights activist Harvey Milk, who was in San Francisco, was a member of city government, was shot and killed, fought for LGBT rights long before there was anything remotely resembling a majority in favor of those things. And just an incredible guy who has had documentaries made about him. There's no shortage of content that you can watch about Harvey Milk, but for dramatic effect, this is far and away the most powerful, I think, of the films, because it has this incredible performance at the center of it with Sean Penn. I cannot rave enough about what Sean Penn did in this movie. And even though it's been out on Blu-ray for a while, I am going to take advantage of the fact that it's being re-released on Blu-ray to just recommend it one more time. Milk from 2008. If you haven't seen it, go watch it, sight unseen. I'm telling you, it's phenomenal. Have you seen it?
I have. I've actually only seen it once though, and it was in theaters when it came out. So even for me, I think this is a good opportunity for a rewatch. I remember it was incredibly moving. I think in large part due to, as you said, Sean Penn's performance. Um, I just remember being so moved by this film. I wish I could remember more details. But yeah, I think even if you've seen it, maybe you're like me and haven't seen it in, gosh, what, like 13 years. And it unfortunately, it never stops being relevant and timely as a story. He never, all the reasons Harvey Milk was such an icon of gay rights activism. I think it's always worth revisiting his story, and yeah, perfect excuse to do it in this particular form, with this film, now that it's being re-released. I don't know why certain things get re-released, but maybe there's a silver lining like we're talking about. So
yeah, I don't understand why it's being re-released either, but I'll take it. I mean, I will, you're right. It is sort of unfortunate how timely it remains, but there is one scene in the movie, which I always recall, just incredibly powerful, where Harvey Milk is sort of in a room with a bunch of other members of the gay community, and I can't remember exactly what had just happened. They had just suffered some kind of setback or defeat, and he gives this monologue where he basically takes a phone and thrusts it at everybody in the room and says, "Pick up this phone and call your mom, call your dad, call your brothers, call your sisters, tell them you're gay." Because they don't know. They think that we're some kind of weird monsters, but they don't know that they all know somebody who's gay, because we're all in the closet. And if you don't tell them you're gay, they'll never believe that we're just as human and just as deserving as they are. And that scene got me so much in the gut, and I've never forgotten it. And it's true. I mean, that was a time when most members of the gay community were very much in the closet, very much afraid to come out of the closet. And it was very easy, I think, for people who were not in the gay community to just write gay people off, because they weren't confronted with not the gayness of gay Americans and gay people, but just the humanity, just the ordinary humanity of gay people. People sort of thought there was something weird and different and unique, and the reality is they're just people. And Harvey Milk famously encouraged people to do that for that reason. And that scene in that film just was amazing. Like I said, I couldn't recommend it enough. And, you have an excuse. It's been re-released, so go watch it.
Yeah, that scene was coming back to me as you were talking about it. Just really, really good movies this month. Like we said, AJFF alums, things that are on multiple streaming platforms that are classic, that I certainly need to catch up on. So yeah, lots of good stuff to hopefully enjoy in your, again, air-conditioned homes if you're not venturing out. I will say Black Widow is really good, and Scarlett Johansson is part Jewish. So I will leave us with that, because I think Marvel films have a place in our cinema landscape as well. But
very good save. Very good save.
Yeah. It's something that popped into my head earlier when you were talking about Marvel and, there being no Jewish superheroes, but we will definitely, talk about that more in future episodes. We've talked about that a lot in past episodes, so it's beating a dead horse at this point, but we will leave you with these picks. We hope you enjoy. And until next time, we are your hosts, Sarah Glassberg
and Brad Pilcher.
Also producing is Chris Holland, who is also our technical director and editor.
The music you are humming along to as we speak is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. Look him up wherever you get your music.
You can always find more from us as well as show notes at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Like we said, please drop us a line with questions or opinions, and we might just bring those up in future episodes.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, give us a review. Every little bit helps.
We should also mention that we cannot continue to do this podcast or any of our other awesome digital programs without the support of listeners like you. So if you are willing, please make a donation at ajff.org/inconversation. And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.